Well, we can get started at 6 o'clock on the dot. I'm very glad you could all be with me today and that I could be of service to you and help you a little bit on your family history journey, learning about the very important census records. I wish I could hear your voices a little more and we could have a more of a chit chat, but feel free to use the chat box to ask any question. I'm really good at presenting and watching the chat box. So feel free to ask any questions there and I'll kind of check on them as we go. But for but yeah, just put in questions. You don't even have to use the Q&A thing. There's a Q&A button if you want to use that. But you can also use the chat box and I'll save time at the end for questions as well. All right, everybody ready to go? Here we go. Let me share my screen. Oops. Let's get on the right page here. And you're going to see double of me for a second. There we go. All right. One more thing I want to do before I'm going to pop this out. Okay. All right. So the census records are so important when doing family history. If you've been doing it for any extent amount of time, or even if you're new to family history, census records are really important to study and are like the backbone to family history research. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is here in just a second. But they're just incredible resources and we're very grateful for them. I wish our censuses that we take today were half as good with information as they used to be. I remember filling out one and being like, this is all they asked for because I know how helpful they are to genealogists. And I wish they did a little bit more for us, for our descendants to know about. All right, so let's click here. What is a census? A census in general is basically just an official count or survey of a population, typically recording various details of individuals. So that's just the generic definition of a census. And so you can have a federal census like we're all used to that happens every 10 years, but there are a city census, there are state censuses, there are even mortality censuses in a sense, so they're a count of people who've passed away. We've seen veteran censuses, there's county censuses and all sorts of stuff like that. So it's an official count or survey of a population. But today, specifically, we're going to talk about the United States federal census that takes place every 10 years. Now, be aware that if you have family history from other parts of the world in different countries, often many countries also have their own censuses, and they can be taken however frequently they do. I know in England, they do it every 10 years, but it's on the one, so it's 1841. 1940, 41, 1950, 51, which makes doing math a little more interesting in family history. But again, every country. And so you can find these anywhere. And the tricks that we're going to talk about the federal censuses and what's in them for each year. But the tips for finding people in the census applies to any kind of census record. And so you can apply that to wherever you're doing research. But again, we'll be talking using the federal census today. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit. It helps to understand the history of the census, the federal census, because that influences how you do your research or what kind of information and things to be aware of. So the very first U.S. federal census was commissioned by George Washington in 1790. So we consider that the very first U.S. federal census is 1790. Between 1790 and 1870, there were these U.S. Marshals that were in charge of collecting the census information. Um, but as the population expanded, as we grew as a country, the government recognized that we need more useful information, more than just people. So they started collecting information like demographics, agriculture, economics, education, all sorts of things. And you'll see that here in a minute of all the different things that you may not be aware of that are in the federal census. And then it was in 1902, so a little bit later than you might think, but 1902 that Congress enacted the US Census Bureau and started a permanent census office, which influences how more accurate, in a sense, the census records get, because we start to see a little more organization with the collection of the census records. Kind of interesting. All right, so why are census records so valuable to the family historian? Well, we call it a snapshot of a family. It's one of the very few records out there that you can basically get a whole picture of the family at one point in time. So if you got my email about taking a family picture, you'll see how a family picture is kind of like a census, in the sense that if you snap a picture in time, you can kind of gather information about that family, the ages, their gender, their economics, their dress, where they're living, and you can tell that all by one photo. The second census records are like that, and that somebody, took an account of the family at one point in time. And so a lot of other records like death certificates or marriage records or obituaries or whatever only focus on one person or a few family members. Whereas a census records, depending on when time it is in the family's life, you can get this kind of overview of the whole family. And that's really valuable. Relationships, you can start to see how an individual or family moved over time, where they moved to. Did they stay in one place? Did they migrate or immigrate? And a census record can help you. You can follow a family over time. If anybody's been trying to do family history before 1790, you know how difficult it is because of the lack of census records, because they provide such a backbone. Every 10 years, you can kind of set yourself up like, okay, this is where the family is now, this is where the family is now, this is where they're now, and then you fill in the gaps with all the other records that there are. But the census records become that skeleton to our family and our ancestors. Through census records, we get also demographics, economics, we learn their status, whether they owned or rented their property, education, like we talked about whether they could read or write, whether they owned slaves, all sorts of things. And it's really valuable. And oftentimes I find that family historians or people who are just starting to do family history or taught themselves, they kind of skip over this information. And you shouldn't do that. You can learn a lot, not only about the family, but about the whole neighborhood that they live in. And we'll talk about how to do that near the end. So a lot of information there. Census records also provide clues about relationships. You'll see that starting in 1880, the census records, they started listing relationships in the census. So how the family members were related to the head of household. That's incredibly valuable. They're not always accurate, as we'll talk about, but they're, good percentage of the time they are. And it's even so prior to 1880, without those relationships listed, you can still kind of figure it out. And it's so helpful to know that these people are related and how they're related. All right. So I'm going to go through each census year and give you a brief description of what's in them and how it can be helpful to you. If you're interested in going in depth or learning more about them and exactly what's in them, you can go to what's called the Wiki on Family Search. So I'll put it in the chat box. It's wiki.familysearch.org, and look under US Census Records, and it goes year by year, and you can basically learn what's in each census record. And that's really kind of fun to do and educational, but we'll give you a good overview today. All right. So as I said, the 1790 census is the first one, and it's very basic because it was more of, just wanting an account of how many people, how many men really, and there were for political reasons, for representation, and also for military purposes. They wanted to know for how many men they had to build an army. So what they did really was they had the name of the head of household, and this is the person who owned the home or the land or whatever. So he was the owner of the household. Usually it's male because of different women's rights. But if a woman owned the home for various reasons, you may find women listed, but they're few. And so you had the head of household. Everybody else in the head of household was just a check mark or a dash. There was nobody else in the household listed by name in the 1790 census, which can be very frustrating, but it's still valuable. You can find the head of household, and then if you know who the people are in the family and generally how old they should have been in 1790, you can kind of match up these checkmark dashes with, okay, I think that's probably Lucy and that's probably Sam, that's a checkmark. So they listed free white males, basically a number, free white males of 16 years and upward, free white males under 16 years of age, and then just how many free white females. Okay, how many females are there? And then how many slaves they had. So very basic. And there's images here to show you kind of what they look. And here's a map of the coverage of the 1790 census in our early colonial days. All right. Here's another picture of what that kind of looked like. So we have here, the name, and then here's all the check marks and their occupation. So I guess I should include that there. Okay. The 1800 census, we get a little more detailed. It included the states and territories northwest of the Ohio River and Mississippi Territory. So that's good to know if you have ancestors in that area. Included the name of household again, and then everybody was a dash, but we got more specific in age range there. So free white males, how many under 10, how many females under 10, how many between 10 and 15, 16 and 25, 25, 45, and then over 45. They grouped everybody. They also included Indians. This was new, slaves, but we start to see some numbers of free blacks. So here's an image of that. So again, if you have an ancestor and you know the children and what their ages were roughly or should be, you can kind of confirm that you got the right person based on those dashes there. So that can be helpful. 1810 U.S. Census, it stipulated that an assistant marshal must actually visit the household or the head of each family within his designated enumeration district and should not rely on hearsay. So it was very common, for a census taker or the marshal to go through town and not really visit each household, just kind of get an idea of who lived here and these people. They could ask a neighbor, they would just ask somebody at the tavern. I don't know. So it was very hodgepodge put together. And so it brought a lot of mistakes. And so when you're working with censuses, and we'll talk about this more, you have to take things with a little bit of a grain of salt, because especially in these early ones, because they were less accurate. But in 1810, an assistant marshal actually had to visit each household. So that's really important and key. Also in 1810, they started collecting more economic data, but we still have the dashes going on. Not much has changed there. And we have slaves, free blacks, or Indians. But the free men of color were listed as their own head of household. So that was new. And that's neat. Here's another image of the coverage for you. Okay. And here's an image, a little better to read. So you can see here, we do have some women. Here's a Hannah listed there in the head of household. Okay, 1820 census, they started to inquire if the individuals were engaged in agriculture, commerce, or manufacturing. And so they kind of had those three categories, and they wanted to know which one they were involved in. And again, more economic data. I don't list them here specifically. So if you're interested in that, you can go to the wiki. We have the number of members in the household. And the females were all same, but they didn't really care about females 16 to 18 because, again, they really wanted to know that age for males for the army. Then they started to list slaves by ages, which is very interesting. We still see the free colored males and females now. And then it also included all other persons except Indians not taxed. So interesting. They also wanted to know foreigners who were not naturalized. So anybody in the visiting or anybody else not in from the country. So we start to see that in the 1820 census. Here's an image. More beautiful numbers. We're getting to the names, so hold on there. In the 1830 census, John Quincy Adams proposed that a collection of age data be extended from infancy in intervals of 10 years to the utmost boundaries of life. So basically, they started to do every 10 years instead of those random age brackets. They started doing every 10 years. So that gets even more helpful if you know generally where they should fit in, or you can start to learn who the people are. You know, they had a child this age. So when you start to learn those names, that you can fit them in the right places. They used uniform printing schedules for the first time. So that's a beautiful thing, is that they started to use more forms, getting more organized again, and that was really helpful. They counted the population only due counted population only due to the poor attempts in previous years of collection data on manufacturing and industry. And then they also had, so name of household, we have the same kind of thing, but we also get to see categories for if they were deaf or what they call dumb and blind. So that again is very interesting. We start to include those individuals. So here's an image. So you can see, here's the form now. If you saw in the past, there was, go back to this image, see how it's more just names and numbers. Whereas here we get to now see the beautiful forms and how that fits in. I'll make a mention that if you have any difficulties reading these forms, places like ancestry.com will talk about that. They now, well, you can zoom in and you can actually hover over on the page and it will tell you what those categories are. So that's nice. 1840 census was actually the creation of a questionnaire. Rather than just this generic information, we start to get a questionnaire on their pursuits, industry, education. They wanted basically to know what are the resources of our country. And they wanted to know school attendance, literacy, vocation. We really want to know what our country is, what do we have to offer, how much of this do we have, and that kind of thing. We still have the same head of household and the people in, check marks, same, deaf, dumb. But now we start to add name of pensioners of the Revolutionary War or other military service. And that's handy to have. These people started to pass away every year this time. And so they wanted to know those pensioners. So if you have any Revolutionary War veterans, that may be something to look into. We also have the number of persons employed in each of the 6 classes of industry that up here that we were already talking about and previously. You can get more detail online. How many people were in school, number of family over 20 who could read and write. So kind of interesting. So here's that form here. All right. The 1850 census, it has arrived. This was the very first census that listed everyone in the household by name. There's a joke in the genealogy world. Now, family history used to be on, a lot of it was on microfilm, those kind of microfiche. And so there was a joke going around that a genealogist's favorite film is the 1850 census because it was where we start to see names. There were no relationships listed, but now we get to see the names and you can kind of figure out relationships. It also included social statistics, including information on taxes, school, crime, wages, value of their estate, mortality, and more. Every marshal was responsible for subdividing his district into civil divisions known as counties, townships, wards. And so this is where you get to see, if you look at a census record, it will say township and it'll have a name, or the ward or something like that. That's because in the 1850 census, they started becoming more of a hierarchy and more organized. We start to also see their age listed, their gender, their color, whether, black or white, their occupation, the value of the real estate. And that's something you want to look into because it will tell you a lot about your ancestor. And then also you can compare it to the other people around them. We also get to see their birthplace, which is huge. Whether they attended school or were married in that year, another big thing, whether they could read or write. Some of the other same things, deaf, dumb, and blind. They also wanted to know if the individual was a fugitive from the state. If I were that person, I don't know if I'd tell. No, would they tell the truth? I don't know. They're a fugitive from state. This 1850 U.S. Census also included the slave schedule. And so if you have ancestors who are slaves, we have the slave schedule, which is huge. So it was the name of the slave owner, the number of slaves owned, their age, whether they were deaf or blind, and so forth, and whether they were a fugitive too. Don't know of anybody who would admit to that. So here it is. Doesn't it look beautiful? I'm such a nerd. That looks beautiful because we see the organized system that it is. We see everybody by name. Here's where we see age, their gender, their occupation, and their birthplace, their value. Huge information to find. So again, you'll get more and more familiar with these columns if this is new to you. 1860 census is very similar to the 1850. Not much else is different there, okay? And it looks awfully the same too. All right, 1870 census, the census questionnaires were reordered and redesigned to account for the end of the slave questionnaire. All right, so there's some new questions that you'll see, but pretty much the same thing, except now we get to see whether their father or mother was a foreign born and what month they were born in the census year and month married in the census year. So if they were born or married within that census year, what month was it? And for both of those things. All right. They also wanted to know if the male was eligible to vote. And we start to see other races like Chinese and mulatto. So that's very interesting. And the census was to list only those abiding in the house as of June 1st. Okay. So if they were out before June 1st, they wouldn't be listed. So that's important to realize. If you're like, wait, why aren't they listed here or something? Doesn't mean they're not living there. It was just, maybe they weren't there prior to June 1st. Okay. Dwelling houses numbered in order of visitation. So that was new too. Before that, you could find census maps that showed census takers going from this place to this place. They're bouncing all over the city and no rhyme or reason to it. But now you can go through a census year and the numbers on the side here are in order of visitation. So first they went here, then they went here, they went here. Doesn't mean that they were necessarily neighbors still. It just means that this was the order that they went in, okay? Now the 1880 census. So we had the 1850 was a landmark census. The 1880 is the next landmark census year because, as I said before, we get relationships and we also get the parents' birthplaces. So we get the same name, race, but we also here get the year they were born. So rather than us having to do math based on their age, it actually listed the year that they were born. And the relationship in the census records are always in relationship to the head of household. So whatever says in-law or anything like that, that's in relationship to the head of household. So always look at who's the head of household and how are they related. We also get marital status, occupation, birthplace, but parents' birthplace. So that's wonderful because we can not only confirm that we have the right person, but we can get clues if we're trying to move back a generation. Same thing if they were deaf, dumb, and blind, but we also have sick or temporarily disabled. And here they started to list the name of the streets and the house numbers of some of the urban homes. Okay, that's really fun and exciting. And there are a lot of major cities have city directories, which I can do another whole webinar about how to use city directories, a huge resource. People born or died after July 1st, 1880 were not included. That's because the census records were taken up to that point. And then if they were, happened after that, okay, if that happened, they were not included. So just be aware of that. This was also the creation of the enumeration districts, they're called. And if you do family history for a while, you start to learn they're basically, some of them these districts followed political boundaries or other jurisdictions, but it was its census takers' way of separating things into enumeration districts. So no more of really of those townships and wards and those kind of things. Here's a picture. So you can start to see all this wealth of information coming into play. Now, let's talk about something really sad to the genealogists, and that is the 1890 census. Unfortunately, in 1921, it was destroyed and severely damaged by a fire. It's a tragic story, and only 1%, less than 1%, was survived. So that's only about 6,000 individuals on the census. And the other sad part was the 1890 census had a ton of information, more than ever before and more than since. So there's this big gap, no 1890 census. There are other records, and I can do a whole class on that, how to meet that gap in the 1890 census. City directories, again, are a huge resource there. But it's really sad. So don't go looking for the 1890 census. I mean, you can try, see if your one ancestor is in the 6,000. I think it's some like Midwest states or something like that have a few, but it's a sad day. All right, so let's jump to the 1900 census. The 1900 census included their address, and we also see the actual month and year that they were born, the number of years they had been married. And this is really helpful. So if you're doing some research and you don't know when your couple, the family's couple were married, you can use the 1900 census to kind of calculate, okay, it says that they've been married for 25 years. What's 25 years minus 1900? There's how old, that's when year roughly that they were married, as long as it's mostly accurate. So that will give you kind of a general time frame to look for a marriage certificate or something like that. It also told you the total number of children born to the mother. And again, you can take a look at that and compare it to the number of children in the household. And if it's different, you know that either some children died or they've grown up and are out of the household. If it's a young family with, a lot of little children, it might mean that, and if you look at the children's age range and you see that there's a major gap between two children, that can tell you that there was a child that died and that you need to do some more digging to figure out who that child is. So take a look at that, look for that thing. We also have, and you'll see that it says total children born to the mother and number of children living. So you can compare those numbers and see if they're the same. We also know if they're foreign born, and in the 1900 census, we get to see their year of immigration. And that's huge, along with the number of years in the U.S. How long have they been in the U.S.? Take a look at those two things and make sure the numbers match. Oftentimes they don't, and there's various reasons why that is. So if you're looking for immigration records or something like that, you'll want to note both years. We also have citizenship status over 21, whether they owned or rented their home, was their home a farm, was it mortgaged, and things like that. So I love the 1900 census, very helpful. Here is a picture of it. We can zoom in here and see a little more detail. Here's where it's how many children or been born and how many are still alive. There's that number there. So that's really nice. Okay. 1910 census, we also get the length of their present marriage. So not only the number of years married, but the actual length of the present marriage. So that could be, sometimes you'll see if it's a second marriage near their marital status, it will say either 1 or 2 next to it. And if it's the number 2, that means this is their second marriage. Their language that they actually spoke. I saw a Who Do You Think You Are, where they were doing some research and they found that the family was from Hungary and spoke Yiddish. And I think it was Hungary. And so they realized that that probably meant that they were Jewish based on the language that they were speaking. The type of industry employed, and they also wanted to know if they were an employer or if they were an employee or self-employed. The number of weeks unemployed in 1909, whether they attended daytime school, if they were a veteran of the Union or Confederate Army. And we also see an Indian schedule recorded. So huge. I mean, you can look at this, it's like, oh my word, so much wonderful information to learn here. And it's very similar to the 1900 census. Okay. The 1920 census, we're almost to the end here. They wanted to know if they attended school, but here we also get to see their father's mother tongue and their mother's mother tongue, what was the language they originally spoke. There was also a statistical study done in 1923 on coal miners, and that's listed in the 1920 census. So if you have ancestors who may have been coal miners, that would be listed separately on the census in this coal miners kind of schedule. It was taken the beginning of 1st of January 1920, so that's kind of a new thing rather than just in the summer months. But children born between the 1st of January 1920 and when the census record was enumerated, which is kind of like closed up, finished, like certified, they didn't include that. It's just children. And it did include people who were alive on January 1st and 1920, but were dead by numeration. So if you're like, I know my person was dead, but they appear in the 1900 census, that may be the reason why. Okay, so kind of some little tidbit, interesting fact. Okay, here's an image full of information. All right, 1930 census. Here's where you get to see the age at their first marriage. And if that doesn't match up with how long they've been married, you can kind of guess, oh, this is a second marriage. And so these are things here. It includes all the other stuff we talked about, but this is some new things. So their language, year of immigration, naturalized or an alien. The date at the top of the page was a response to the questions as of 1st of April, 1930. So again, if something happened after that, all right. Lists if the individual attended college, if they owned a radio set, and also whether the individual was at work the day before the census was taken, if they were a veteran of a war or expedition. Okay. The 1940 census. Now, the 1940 census is the last census year available to the public. There's a law that the census record is made public 72 years after its creation. So that was in order to protect the privacy of those on the census records. Basically, they felt that by 72 years later, they would have been dead. But we know that people live much longer than that. And now we have Facebook, all sorts of things. So it's like, come on, can't we have a census record out? But so every 12 years, a new census record is available to us. And if I remember right, the 1940 census came out in 2012. So we got a little ways to go before the 1950 census. And every genealogist is waiting for that 1950 census to come out. But the 1940 census is still extremely valuable because one of the nice things is there is a check mark next to the name of the informant. So the person who provided the information to the census taker, Census Bureau. In the past, all the other census years that we've looked at, we don't know who provided that information to the census taker? Was it the head of household? Was it the mother? Was it a child? Was it a neighbor because nobody was home? And that's important to realize, as we'll talk about, because there are census records where a woman does not ever age every 10 years. And sometimes there can be just inaccurate information. It's because we don't know who provided it. But the 1940 census, we can see who was it and how accurate is it because of that. The other thing too is we also get to know whether the individual was present or absent. And there's a little AB if they were absent from the home. So that's nice. Includes their residence as of April 1st, 1935. So there's like a little blurb under, like next to it, that not only says where they were born, but also what was their residence as of 1935. Don't know why they did this, but it's very helpful because we have where were they in between 1930 and 1940, and you'll often see that they're different than where they are now in 1940, and we can look for some records wherever that place is in 1935. It also includes the highest grad of school completed, employment status details. There's also at the bottom, it includes a census sample, which included more questions. So I think there's 2 people on every census page who were asked additional questions. So the likelihood of your ancestor being one of those is huge. So always in the 1940 census, look at the bottom of the page to look at those extra census sample questions. Okay. And here's the image of 1940. And if you look down below, it has extra information and question there. You can also see here, if I zoom in, these little marks here. And see if I can find, some of these are X's. They're the informant. Okay. Or sometimes they were in other places, I believe, too. All right. Any questions so far? If you have a question, and when I ask that, and you're kind of typing away crazy, you can put a question mark first in the chat box and send that, and then I'll always know, hey, I'm typing something, and I'll wait for a minute. But if not, we'll just keep on moving on. Okay. All right. So for those who are new to family history, we'll just talk very briefly on where you can find actual census records. Basically, the best 2 places to look for census records are FamilySearch.org and Ancestry.com. All right. Now, Ancestry.com, you have to have a paid subscription for. All right. But if you're going to get really into family history, it's worth it. You can also often get access to Ancestry.com at local libraries or family history centers. FamilySearch.org is free, so you can do it from home. It's free. There are pros and cons to one versus the other, and I'll talk about that in some of our tips going forth. But I'm going to close this for my PowerPoint here for just a second and go to these websites here. Oh, come on, thing. It's going to stop my share for just a second. And all right, Ancestry.com. So here's Ancestry.com, and you just come up here to search, and you can come up here to census records and U.S. Federal Census Collection over here. And when I'm doing census records search, and we'll talk about this again too in just a minute, I like to go to the specific year. So you'll see here that you can just search every census year, search for this individual. That's one way of doing things. But what I like to do, if you scroll down, I know that they lived between 1845 and 1920. So I can come up here, okay, 1850 census, let's look just in the 1850 census. Now I'm ready to move on to 1860 census. Let's look just in the 1860 census. This helps you stay very focused in your family history research. If you were to only use the search engine here at the top and search every census, that any year that they might appear in, you can get confused. Is this the right person? All sorts of stuff, and you can go on little bunny trails. So to stay focused, I highly recommend pick the actual year you want to search in first, and it will actually help you manipulate the data or the search engine to find exactly what you want with some of the tips that we'll talk about here in a second. So the same thing applies when you're searching family search. If you come up here to search and then go to records, instead of using this main search engine, scroll down and go to browse all published collections. And then you can either go under collection name, or you can do the control find function on your computer and type in United States Census. And down here are all the census years, and just click on it and search just the census of the year that you need. Okay, so that's a first little tip for you there. Okay, so couple of warnings before you go into the world of census records. As I said before, you want to take all the information that you find on the census record with a grain of salt. Don't think because it's in the census record, it must be true, therefore that's the end, zip. No, the census record, and of any genealogy record, you need to take everything with a little grain of salt. Hannah, the professional genealogist, put my mom's birthplace wrong on my marriage record. Okay, so not only are we going to have mistakes done by the census taker, but again, as I said before, we don't know who provided the information, and it could be inaccurate. So look at this picture here. I think this is in Hawaii or something. And this is the census. This is a legit picture of a census taker going around asking this woman, hey, who lives here? What are their ages? You know, maybe she's asking who lives next door. They're asking that. She says, well, I think that there's 4 children, and I think their ages are 11, 5, 4, and 1. And the husband, I think he's from Missouri. Yeah, he's from Missouri, and he's actually from Illinois. Okay, so that happens often. So be aware of that whenever you're looking at it. And that's why you want to look for every census record the person's in, so you can kind of build up a case for it. Children's ages are often more accurate in census records than adults. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One is, like we just talked about, when, an adult, once you're an adult, it's kind of hard to distinguish age difference. You can be like, well, I think she's 55. Like, how old is it when you get to 20 something that you really don't care about 28 and 29, or 31 or 32 kind of thing. But with children, a 4-year-old is very different than a 6-year-old. And so those children's ages are often more accurate. So when you're having difficulties finding someone, an ancestor in the census records, instead of looking for just the head of household or the mother, look for one of the children. I've often found them that way because I'm plugging in the year that the father was born and not finding anything. But if I plug in the year that the child was born, I find him, because the children's ages are often more accurate. You also want to think very broadly and open-minded when searching census records, and we'll talk about this when you're doing your searches, because you think you may know your family, but anything could really have happened back then. And what you may think is true from family lore could be wrong. And also where you think they are could be very different. And so just be aware of that. Be very open-minded to where they may have moved, who are they, how many children they had, what order those children were in. I have a family history book, compiled family history thing that's been passed down to my family. And it was inaccurate in which marriage happened when. They had the first marriage second and the second marriage first, and the children out of order and everything like that. So just be open-minded when you're ready to then search. It was a census records that taught me that this compiled lineage was wrong. So again, keep an open mind as we move forward. And let's see here, make sure I have my chat box open. Okay. If you have any questions, just throw them in there. Okay. So let's do some tips and some case studies when searching the census. You want to make sure that when you are doing your family history, if you're just starting and you've picked your family that you're going to work on, you want to find every census year that every person in the household was living in. So first, the father, find every census as much as you can for every year, every, census record he was alive in. So he was, born in 1811. So you'll want to look in the 1820 census, 1830, 1840, 1850, 1860, until he passes away, or when you just can't find him. And maybe that will tell you when he passed away. Same thing for each family member. And I highly recommend doing that first above all else. Just find as much as you can. You may not find every census record right off the bat, but you want to just collect that as much as possible. So, Kathy, you said, how do you organize all the data you collect from the census record? There's so much. Oh, it's so true. First of all, I like to make sure I have a digital copy of the census records. And then I have here a little example of a table that I put together for a family history class. You don't have to do this, but it can be really helpful to see it this way. This just basically tells you each year. I can see it where he was living, and it's the source of there. But what you could do instead of the source, or you should include the source, but you could include little just important information that you want to know for yourself. You don't have to include every economic thing about him, but if you want to remember, he's married at this time and this kind of thing and those kinds of things, if you want to take those notes, either create a table or a spreadsheet. For tax lists, I would do this. So I had a header for each thing I wanted to include for each one, and I would just plugged it in, and that was really helpful. But I would pick and choose what you think, for the information that will help you find other records. So you can gather information to learn about them and kind of learn new things about them and record that. But the information like their parents' birthplace and how many years they've been married and the year they've immigrated, those are really key information that you would want to have handy, so you don't have to always look up that census year. Have that in a place really handy. That was a really good idea. I've never actually done that really well, that much in that much detail, but that's a really good idea so that you don't always have to go back. Does that help, Kathy? Just kind of pick there. Cool. All right, that's a good idea. Okay, so make sure you get every census year that they possibly can. And then that will also, the other thing that will help you with is to know if you missed a year. If you only used the main search engine, you're just gathering hodgepodge what you can, rather than systematically going and gathering each one, you may be like, oh, you know what? The son moved out of the household and I don't have his census. And the reason why, not only do you want his census to learn about him and to complete whole families, but his census record after he's left home will tell you information about the parents that could be really key to know about. So it's important to gather all the information as much as possible. You can also use, Kathy, family tree software programs to help you put that information in. So something, maybe, I don't know if you use ancestry.com or whatever it is, but something like Roots Magic. The nice thing about those is, and I think ancestry.com, you can do this too, but you can create new events. So as you gather new information, like their residence or year of military service or, year of immigration, there may not be a field for that in the family tree software program, but you can create one and add a new event to help keep track of it, and then list the source where you got the information. So that's helpful too. Something like Roots Magic, you can get a lot more detail into specifics, and then you can see it all together as one. If you want more information about that, Kathy, let me know. I'm happy to kind of share that in more detail. So we talked about before that to think more open-minded when you are searching for family. Now, when you first start searching, you may know a lot about the individual. And so when you go to the search engine, you just kind of want to plug in everything you know about the person And if it's your lucky day in the family history, angels and gods are looking nicely upon you, you will find what you're looking for. But you may not. And lots of times you don't. And so what you end up doing is you start taking away pieces of information in your search engine to then think more broadly because of those errors and because of information that you may not be aware of. So you may have thought that, Bob was born in Massachusetts. That's what you know. That's what's been passed down. A couple of the records say Massachusetts, but in the census record, it actually says New Hampshire or New York. And so if you're looking for a Bob Smith and you're only putting in Massachusetts, born in 1880, nothing's coming up. It's because in the census record, it's listed as New York, not Massachusetts. So instead of just hitting yourself against the wall, take away the birthplace and look for a Bob Smith born in 1880 living in this place. And you're like, oh, wait, that's him. And it says his birthplace is New York, not Massachusetts. But I know it's him because everything else matches up. Okay. So here's an example of this. All right. So I researched a woman named Horace, unfortunately, is her name. But she went by Constance, or Connie, I probably would too, Williams. She was born in 1891 in Missouri. Okay. She died in 1981 in Portland, Oregon. She was raised by her grandmother in Missouri starting at the age of 9. She married for the first time to an Avery Perry. What I knew, my client told me is that she'd been married 6 times, but her first marriage was to an Avery Perry at the age of 16. They had a daughter named Thelma Perry, but Avery Perry died 17 months after Thelma was born. I also knew that she lived in Kansas in 1911. All right. So I found Connie in the 1900 census, but in 1910, where she would have been, let me make sure I'm doing my math right. So in 1900, she would have been 9 years old. By 1910, she would have been 19 years old. Okay. So she would have been Connie Perry would be her last name, right? But she would not be living with Avery. All right. So question is, let's try to find her in the 1910 census. So here in the 1910 census, I put in Constance Perry. Now, what is her name? Is it Horace? Is it Connie? Or is it Constance? So what you want to do is you want to try all the different ones. And you can start with the one, most often, usually, full names, but sometimes nicknames like Connie. So first try Constance Perry. And I put the birth year, 1891, Missouri. All right. And that's what I put in, and I do a search. And as you can see here, none of these match up to Constance Perry. So you go back to the search engine and you start to you can add information. So I decided to put in Horace, do a search, nothing comes up. All right. So now I'm going to play around with the search engine. And this is why it's important to just look in the specific year that you're interested in rather than everything else. All right. So 1910 census, I decided to put in her name, Constance. I took out her last name because my client said she'd been married 6 times. So I wondered, is she married by 1910? Did he die and then she shortly after married and her last name is different? So I left her last name blank. I still left in 1891 and Missouri, but this time I added a family member, a child named Thelma, because she had a child named Thelma. So that helps me narrow down. Rather than every Constance who was born around 1891 in Missouri, I'm looking for a Constance 1891 Missouri named Thelma. As you can see, I left the location empty because if she got married, I don't know exactly where she would have been. All right. Do a search, and here I found her, and her name was Constance Lenhart, age 18 by 1910, which is right about 1892, good enough, in Missouri birth. And she's living in Kansas. So my client had told me that in 1911, she was in Kansas. It also says that she was widowed, and it lists a Thelma Lenhart and Constant Lenhart. I know that this is the right person because age, location of birth, location of living, and also how many Constants with a daughter named Thelma are there in Kansas in 1900, and that the child's age matches up as well. So unfortunately, her second husband also passed away by that time. Really sad story. But I would not have found it if I didn't start taking away and adding and kind of what I call manipulating the search engine with various information. Right. The next tip I have, and let me just say, going back to specific and broad, I do this all the time. You just get really good at manipulating the data. Think of all the clues you know about the person and try the different ages, try a different birthplace, take away the birthplace, do all these different things and just kind of take away and add and draw all these different things. If it's helpful, you can write down a list of all the different ways you try it so you can keep track and be like, oh, I didn't try it this way. Let's try that. I have heard of people doing that, and that can be helpful if you're really stuck and can't find them. Okay. The next tip is to be aware of Ancestry.com versus Family Search. I personally like looking up census records on Ancestry.com first. I think that they do a good job in, I just like the user interface for Ancestry.com. So I usually start there. And then if I can't find anything, look in Family Search. So if you're having a hard time and you're looking on one or the other, Family Search or Ancestry.com, and you can't find something, flip over to the other one. And the reason for this is because Ancestry.com and Family Search have different groups of indexers. And those are the people who look at the record and interpret the handwriting and decide, what does it say? And so an indexer for Ancestry.com could look at a name very differently than Family Search's indexer. And to be honest, Family Search's indexing can be a little more accurate than Ancestry.com. A long time ago in the past, Ancestry.com, someone told me, so don't quote this, they outsourced their indexing to other countries. And so it was, people of not the English language were reading it. Whereas Family Search, and I don't think that's necessarily true anymore, but Family Search has two indexers who read every record and then an arbitrator who decides who it is what's the final say. And I would imagine Ancestry.com does something very similar now too. But so that indexing is different. So you'll want, if you can't find something, jump over to the other one, and you may find it just by doing that because somebody did it more accurately than another. Another reason is Family Search is a little more forgiving or liberal in the search field. So on Ancestry.com, like for Constance, her last name, I have an ancestor whose last name is Messegee, Messegee. It gets very butchered in family history records. And so instead of being able to put George M and give me anybody whose last name starts with M, I can't do that on Ancestry.com. I need at least 3 characters in the surname to then find something. Whereas on Family Search, they don't care. So it's a little more forgiving in the search fields. And I, again, have had major success when I can't find it on one, flip to the other and find it. So if you're having troubles, give that tool a try. As we talked about before, if you're having difficulties locating someone, search for other family members, spouse, and especially younger members in the family. Just jump to them and you may find it. So here's an example of not the children, but looking for other family members. I did some research for a man whose grandfather was James William Owen. He was born on the 10th of December, 1927 in Arkansas. His mother died in childbirth, and he is not listed in the 1930 or 40 census with his father and siblings. So I was like, where in the world is a 3-year-old and a 13-year-old hiding? Why is a 3-year-old not listed with his father and siblings? If you were a father with 8 children, I can't remember, it was a big number of children, and a little tiny infant was, with no mother, what would you do with that infant? You may have someone else, a family relation, raise the child. It finally occurred to me. I was searching and searching and searching and searching for James William Owen and couldn't find anything. So I had the idea, what if he's being raised by grandparents or someone else, another family member? So I kept looking for him, but I changed his relationship to, rather than be a son, to be a grandson, to be it's like all these things. Oh, it's driving me crazy. I could not find him anywhere. So I said, okay, I bet he's living with an aunt or uncle. Who could be an aunt? Who's an aunt and uncle of the father or the mother? Who's the sibling of the father or mother? Luckily, somebody else had done a lot of research on both the father and mother, and on Ancestry.com, the siblings were listed. So I decided, let's look at the mother's side first, the one who had died in childbirth. And I looked at all her siblings. Here were all her siblings, all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 siblings, or I guess, there's 9 siblings there. Which one, if did, raised William to, and could be in the 1930 census? So I kind of buckled my seatbelt and I said, all right, I'm going to look for these individuals, these siblings in the 1930 census and see who's living with them. And I started at the bottom and worked my way to the top. I also clicked on, you can see here that the children near the bottom are a little more completed than the top. And so there was more information about them. So I said, well, maybe it's one of these here. Let's just start there. That's more accessible to me rather than doing a bunch of research here. This should be easier. So I started at the bottom, nothing with William Bryan Scott. So then I jumped to Viola and found out that she had a new married name. And I found her and her family in the 1930 census. And zoom in here. She married the last name Straight, a man by the name of Curtis Straight. So here he is, Curtis Straight, head of household, living in, this is in, is that Arkansas? And down here is Viola. Here's their first child, Julia, and a daughter, Marguerite, and then another daughter, Elizabeth. And then here it says a son, J.W. Straight. His name was James William Owen. So I was like, when I saw this, I was like, J.W. Straight. Okay. And then I looked at the age, and here are children, 17, 15, 10, 2.5. 10 and 2.5 is a big age range. You can guess that a family had a child every 2 years. So if there's a big gap like that, that means either a child, died or whatever. But in this case, okay, a 2-year-old, 2.5-year-old. So I was like, I need to confirm one thing. Let's find the family in the 1940 census. So I found him in the 1940 census. Here's Curtis, Viola. Those other 3 daughters are gone and married off, I guess. And they're left with J.W. Straight, who's 12. But here it says, instead of son, it says Ward. And here in parentheses, it says J.W. Owen. Da, 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 da. We had some little music going on. That's how I was able to find him. Well, number one, I couldn't find him because in the indexing on Ancestry.com and Family Search, his last name was Straight, not Owen. So I'm never going to find him. And so that's the only way, was searching other family members to find him. That's a big case. Not everybody's going to have an ancestor like that in this instance, but it's a good example of searching for other people. If I have a descendant who was researching me generations from now, trying to figure out who my parents were and keeps hitting a brick wall, my death certificate doesn't say anything, my census record doesn't say birthplaces of the parents. But if my descendants were to research my brother and look at his death certificate and it lists the parents' names, they're my parents too, and there you go. Hopefully. And also on the census records, it may list the place, the name of their parents, or maybe the parents are living with that sibling versus your person that you descend from. You never know what you're going to find, but that's why it's so important to look for every single person in the census record. And when you're having difficulties, look for other people, extended family as well. Okay. Be aware of name variations and wildcards, and use wildcards. So name variations such as, Anderson or Anderson. Bye, Kathy. I'll send you the recording. Thank you. So you want to be aware of any kind of name variations that could go on by either the census taker or the indexer. So if an E is kind of smudged on a census and maybe an O, be aware of that. I have worked with people who are like, they spelled it Anderson with an O, not Anderson with an E. And I'm like, oh my goodness, come on. Who knows what it was written there? So be aware of name variations and try those variations when you're using the search engines. You can also use wildcards, which is that asterisk there on, and what that does is, remember the ancestor whose last name was Messegee, Messegee. I could put in MESS asterisk, and what that does is it searches for any last name starting with MESS with any variation following. So that's really helpful. And I actually have that case study here. George Messegee, 1870 U.S. Census, born in Greece, raised his family in Washington State. And I'm going to pop over here to the federal census. You can see this in action. And wow, refresh the page. So if I were to just put in George Messegee, and I think it was, what did we say, born in 1837. Okay, so can't keep up every ancestor straight. Okay, in Greece. So let's say we'll search there in Washington. Nothing comes up. But if I come here, let's say take out Washington State, nothing comes up. Edit search. I could take away Greece, but what I'm going to do instead is MESS asterisk. So you'll see here's George MESS with any variation following, but the very first one is George Messenger. And basically this is him. I know that this is him because not many people were born from Greece in this time period. I know that he was in Montana gold mining. I know his age is a little off, but he was a grocer. Everything matches. And we can come here and see the image. And it's kind of fishy whether it is ER, and that again could be, he's in a mining town and somebody doesn't know how to say Messegee, or it's an indexing error, who knows. So be aware of that, okay? Let's go back to the PowerPoint. Very handy trick to use for those unique names, or any kind of name, really. If you're having difficulties, give it a shot. All right. You can use other records to determine an individual's family's residence or family members. And what I mean by this is, if you're having difficulty figuring out where somebody is, you can't find the census, you look at the children's birthplaces and where are they born. That can give you a clue as to where you could look for then where they were living, where is the residence. So if you have a child who's born in 1921 in Portland, Oregon, it's likely that the family lived in Portland, Oregon in 1920. Not always, but there's a higher accuracy, and it's a good place to start when you are searching. So use that and any other records, so death certificates, anything that gives you a clue as to the residence of the family can help you find the individual. You also want to pay attention to all the information on census records. So here, Cassandra Messagey, she listed her father's birthplace different than any other census record. So here she is, right here in the very middle, Messagey Cassandra. She was born in Washington, and it says that her father was not born in Greece, but in Turkey. Only census record that ever says that, only record, until I found his immigration record, which confirmed that he did come from the Ottoman Empire at the time, which then later became part of Greece, okay, where he was living specifically. Okay. Now, if you have an ancestor with a common name, and there's a lot of people with that same name, you'll want to use a map or just Google Maps really to help you determine, is this my guy? Because, you know, if you're looking and family lives in the same area for several decades, you can know that the man who lives closest to that area is more likely your guy than somebody in a different state. Right. So you may need to use geographics to help you know, okay, this is probably the right guy because of where he's located according to other records and information. Be sure to revisit these census years over and over again. So, you know, Kathy mentioned, how do you organize all this information? This is a great reason to organize it. I had an ancestor, Milton Frazier, in the 1860 U.S. Census. Here he is in Kentucky. And I never noticed, so here he is right here, his wife, they were born in Kentucky, but the children, James was born in Oregon, Eliza in Oregon, and it goes on. But this 1860 census is in Kentucky. Turns out, I had no idea that this Milton Frazier was drawn to Oregon and settled a donation land claim, but then moved back to Kentucky. His brother moved to Oregon later and settled there, and that's who I descend from. But I had no idea that this sibling of his also experienced time in Oregon, and I didn't catch the children's birthplaces because I was researching Milton, and I was kind of just like, okay, concerned with Milton. Why it's so important to follow each child and kind of look and revisit these sources over and over again. I couldn't find Milton in the 1850 census anywhere. And it turns out, oh, it's because he was in Oregon Territory. Eventually found him in Missouri on his way to Oregon. All right. Any questions so far? Anything? Okay. Feel free to just throw them in. We're going to do a little case study to close things out here. Hopefully you'll be able to follow along. This is to show you how census records can be used with other types of records. This is a case study with land records and tax lists. So I'll be doing a webinar eventually about land records and tax lists, and you'll see the tax list information in that. But this one is kind of how I use those two to get these together with census records. So here's Jeremiah Frazier in the 1830 census. No, excuse me, 1790 census, 1800 census, 1810, it goes on, okay, into 1830, all the time he was living in Jessamine County, Kentucky, all right? I then can't find him anywhere in the 1840 U.S. Census. I'm like, what? He's in Kentucky. And then, so I did a tax list survey, and this is how I gathered it into a spreadsheet. And Kathy, you can see here's a spreadsheet of tax lists. And you'll see that I follow him from year to year, 1801, and then kind of jump 1824. And he's gone in 1832. This man moved every 9 years to a different county, if not more in between. Okay. So I'm like, where did he go? I then find a Jeremiah Frazier in the 1850 U.S. Census with a spouse of the right name, but I wanted to confirm that it was the right person. And this is because this is in a different county. It's in Wayne County, Kentucky, which is several counties south of Jessamine County. So I'm like, okay, I want to make sure this is the right guy. And correct, Jeremiah Frazier. So here I can kind of show you. It's not too far, but it's far enough for me to be like, and it's a unique name. But I found in the land in an 1803 land deed. So this is from Jessamine County, a land transaction with Jeremiah Fraser. And he's doing a transaction of land, buying land from a James Fraser. And this James Fraser says that he was in Wayne County. So he was selling some land that he had in Jessamine County to Jeremiah Fraser, but this James Fraser lived in Wayne County. So it's like, aha, he has relationships in Wayne County. So this is probably the same guy. So I look up tax lists in Wayne County, and here I find him in 1841. So remember, I don't know where he is in 1840. Can't find him. He's not in Wayne County. But in 1850 he is, because here's 1841, 42, 43, 45, 50. And I know this is him because these are his sons living here with them. Okay. This is the 1860 census. And here's Jeremiah Fraser, 83 years old, living with his son, Garrett Fraser, in Boyle County, Kentucky. He's a widow. His wife has died. All right. In Wayne County, Kentucky, I see some land transaction that says that he was selling land in Pulaski, or that he was living. So he was in Pulaski County, selling land to Fraser, another man in Wayne County. All right. So this gave me a clue that maybe his wife died in Pulaski County, not Boyle and not Wayne. So the census records, 1850 said he lived in Wayne County. 1860 census said he lived in Boyle County. So somebody may consider, oh, his wife died in one of those two counties. But with the land records, we learned that, oh, they in between those 2 years, they lived in Pulaski, and that's where she probably died, perhaps. Okay. And so I look up the tax lists in there, follow them for a few years. And here's the 1860 census again, and some tax lists. I'm going to kind of skip through. I learned that there's a fire in Boyle County, so they only lived there for a couple years. No Jeremiah Fraser in the 1870 census. He would have been 93 years old, and so he probably died. But where is that Jeremiah Fraser in the 1840? I'm going to kind of skip here, in the 1840 U.S. Census. And so I decided to look for other family members. He'd been living with his son, Garrett Fraser, and his daughter and her husband, Benjamin Scanlon. So I looked up Benjamin Scanlon in the 1840 census because he has a little more unique name than Jeremiah Fraser. And here I find Benjamin Scanlon in Monroe County, Tennessee. And I'm looking at this, and then I realized, and I looked up, and there's Jeremiah Fraser listed at the top. And I'm like, oh my goodness, there he is. And I had remembered I had seen a Jeremiah Fraser in Monroe County, Tennessee in 1840 census, but I didn't think it was him because what is he doing in Tennessee? His whole life had been in Kentucky. Because of other family members, I was able to confirm that this was him. For some reason, he went to Tennessee. You know, we can predict what our ancestors may do, but it's not always accurate. So these are some of the places he lived. And other family members. I do also want to mention that I talked about you can do a demographic study, and I'm going to pull that up here with a census record. So if you know where your ancestor lived and you find him in the census record, so look at your family on the census record and then look at all the other people surrounding him, and do that a few pages after and a few pages before. Just kind of look at who's the people in his neighborhood. Are they affluent? Is this a lot of, rich people in the area? Are these immigrants, or are they migrating from the Pacific Northwest? What kind of industry? Is this a mining town? Is this a, railroad industry? What is it? And are there children? Is it mostly men? What kind of families? And you can do this is just a report here that I did in college. So here's a paragraph. This is about Seattle. Though the nationality composition was diverse, family makeup is very similar. The vast majority of the families consisted of a husband and wife with 2 or 3 children living at home, and most of those children were under the age of 12. Couples were either in their mid-30s or mid-40s, married 15 to 20 years, or they were young marrieds in their 20s, clearly just starting out. Either way, it is interesting to note that the relative size of family was small, though there were a few larger families with children ranging from ages 2 to 18. Perhaps with the older couples, their eldest children had moved out. But the Seattle was an urban setting rather than an agrarian one is evident in the census. About 60% of the families rented homes. The other 40% owned them. None of these properties were farms. It'd be interesting to know the value of the homes, to learn something, so yada yada. So that's just kind of an idea of the kind of demographics that you can pick out of the neighborhood that your ancestor was living in. All right. So that is concluding the basics about family history and census records and how they can be so valuable, along with some tips to do finding your ancestor in them. I hope that you learned something new there that will help you out and help you break through some brick walls, or if you're just starting your family history, give you confidence to explore these records and to locate your family. The biggest, struggle you may have is reading the handwriting, but you'll get used to that. And feel free to email me. There's my email, hannah@hannahzallen.com, with any questions. If you're struggling to find somebody or something like that, I'm happy to help out that way. Thank you so much for coming to my webinar, and I will send you a recording of this that you can have access for a week and you can review, along with some notes. I will send that out your way as well. So if you have any questions, I'm going to stop the recording now. But if you have any questions and you want to stick around, I can just throw them in the chat box. You're welcome, Kathleen. Just put a little question mark in the chat box if you have any questions there. But thanks for coming. Have fun.